An adopted little boy notices a billionaire CEO at the park and says to his adoptive mom, "Hey mom, this man has the same birthmark as me." She looks up, curious, and immediately freezes in disbelief. Before we begin this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The park was buzzing with life, children laughing, parents chatting, dogs chasing after frisbees. It was one of those perfect afternoons where the sun cast a golden glow over everything, and the air smelled of freshly cut grass and melting ice cream. Lauren sat on a wooden bench near the playground, sipping her coffee as she kept an eye on Caleb, her 6-year-old son, who was running around in his usual carefree way. He had always been a ball of energy, moving from one activity to the next like he was afraid of missing out on something exciting. She smiled as she watched him climb up the play structure, his small hands gripping the bars tightly before sliding down with a triumphant whoop. He landed on his feet, giggling, before taking off toward the swings. Lauren knew he could keep going for hours if she let him. Then, just as she turned her attention back to her coffee, she heard his voice, high-pitched and filled with curiosity. "Hey, Mom!" Caleb called out, his tone laced with excitement. "That man has the same birthmark as me!" Lauren blinked and looked up, confused. Caleb was standing still now, his tiny finger pointing across the park toward a man sitting on a bench not too far away. At first, she barely registered anything unusual, just a well-dressed man in a tailored suit, scrolling through his phone, his expression distant. But then her eyes traveled to his face, and she felt her breath hitch. A birthmark. Not just any birthmark. The same one Caleb had. Lauren's heart skipped a beat. The rare, oddly shaped mark on Caleb's right cheek had always been something unique, something she had never seen on anyone else before. But now, on this stranger's face, in the exact same spot, was an identical mark. It was uncanny. She swallowed, shaking off the momentary shock. It was just a coincidence. It had to be. There were billions of people in the world. What were the odds? Still, she couldn't stop herself from staring. The man, seemingly oblivious at first, continued scrolling through his phone. But then, as if sensing eyes on him, he looked up, and his gaze landed directly on Caleb. His expression shifted, his brow furrowing slightly. He looked, then looked again, his phone lowering ever so slightly as his gaze flicked between the little boy and Lauren. Lauren felt a sudden, unsettling feeling creep into her chest. Caleb, in his usual unfiltered way, was still staring too. "Mom, look! It's just like mine!" He tapped his own cheek enthusiastically, as if she hadn't already noticed. Lauren forced herself to snap out of it, putting a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Okay, honey, let's not point at people, okay? It's not polite." "But Caleb..." Her voice was gentle but firm. Caleb huffed but dropped his hand. He was still staring, though. So was the man. Lauren gave him an awkward smile before turning her attention back to Caleb. "Why don't you go on the swings for a bit?" Caleb hesitated, clearly still intrigued by the man, but after a moment, he nodded and ran off toward the swings, his curiosity briefly forgotten. Lauren, on the other hand, found it much harder to let it go. She risked another glance at the man. He was still looking in their direction, but this time, there was something else in his expression. Confusion. Recognition. Like he was trying to place a memory he couldn't quite reach. Then, as if catching himself, he shook his head, straightened his posture, and went back to his phone. Lauren exhaled slowly. Maybe she was overthinking this. It was just a birthmark. A rare one, sure, but that didn't mean anything. And yet, something about the way the man had looked at Caleb. She glanced at him one last time before shifting her focus back to her son, pushing the thoughts away. It wasn't her place to dwell on coincidences. And yet, even as she tried to enjoy the rest of their afternoon at the park, that nagging feeling refused to leave. Lauren tried to brush it off. She really did. But as she tucked Caleb into bed that night, smoothing his blanket over his tiny frame, her mind kept drifting back to the man at the park. The way he had looked at Caleb. The way Caleb had recognized something in him. The birthmark. She had never thought much about it before. It was just part of who Caleb was, just another detail that made him special. But now, it felt like a puzzle piece she hadn't even known was missing. Caleb was already drifting off, exhaustion from the day settling in. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "Good night, sweetheart." But as she turned off the light and stepped out of his room, she couldn't ignore the gnawing in her chest. By the time she sat down in front of her laptop with a glass of wine in hand, the thought had become a full-blown itch she needed to scratch. She wasn't the type to go on wild goose chases, but something about today felt different. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen something she wasn't supposed to, something that changed everything. It started as simple curiosity. She typed the words, "Gabriel Langford CEO," into the search bar, expecting nothing more than the usual corporate nonsense, press releases, interviews, the kind of carefully curated online presence billionaires had. But as she scrolled, reading about his real estate empire, his sharp business acumen, and his no-nonsense approach to leadership, something else caught her eye. A detail that made her stomach drop. Years ago, he had been in a highly publicized relationship with a woman named Emma Chandler. Lauren's breath itched. The name was familiar. Heart pounding, she pulled up Caleb's adoption paperwork. She had gone through these documents countless times before, had stared at the name of the woman who had given birth to her son and then disappeared. Emma Chandler. A French citizen. No known father listed. She felt like the ground had been yanked from under her. Gabriel Langford had been in a relationship with Emma Chandler. And then, suddenly, Emma had vanished overseas. Right around the time she had given birth to Caleb. Lauren felt lightheaded, her fingers tightening around her glass. Could it really be this simple? Could that man, the one Caleb had pointed out so innocently, actually be his biological father? She scrolled frantically, her pulse roaring in her ears. The timeline lined up almost too perfectly. According to articles, Gabriel and Emma had been together for nearly a year before things ended abruptly. No clear reason was ever given for their breakup, and from what Lauren could gather, Emma had left the country soon after. Lauren closed her laptop and ran a hand down her face. This wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. But if Gabriel Langford was Caleb's father, did he know? And more importantly, if he didn't, what would happen if he found out? Gabriel Langford was a man who rarely let anything rattle him. He had built his empire on control, on discipline, on the ability to see 10 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. But ever since he left the park that afternoon, he had felt like something was off. He couldn't stop thinking about the boy with the birthmark. The same damn birthmark. He had gone home, poured himself a drink, and told himself it was nothing. Coincidences happen all the time. But the way the boy's mother had looked at him, that flicker of recognition, of hesitation, it had wormed its way into his thoughts and refused to leave. He could still hear the kid's voice. "Hey, Mom! That man has the same birthmark as me." He had brushed it off at first. But now, sitting in his office late at night, staring at the skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows, his mind kept circling back to a past he had long since buried. Emma. He hadn't thought about her in years. Their time together had been a whirlwind, fast, passionate, complicated. He had cared about her, more than he probably should have, but things had fallen apart, and then she was gone. Just gone. One day she was in his life, and the next she had vanished. At the time, he had been too focused on his career to chase after her. And if he was being honest, part of him had been angry. She had left without a word, without a real goodbye. But now, for the first time in years, he was thinking about her again. And he couldn't ignore the timeline that was forming in his head. He pulled out his phone and dialed the only person who might have a clue, his best friend and business partner, Jason. Jason answered on the third ring, his voice groggy. "You do know it's almost midnight, right? I need to ask you something," Gabriel said, ignoring the irritation in his friend's voice. Jason groaned. "This better not be about those quarterly reports, man. They're done." "It's not that," Gabriel said, rubbing his temples. "It's... Do you remember Emma? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Jason sighed. Yeah. Of course. Why? Gabriel hesitated, suddenly feeling ridiculous. Did I ever tell you why she left? Jason scoffed. You barely talked about it back then. One day you were seeing her, the next she was gone. Figured she just bailed. Gabriel exhaled sharply. She didn't just bail. She left the country. Another pause. Then, Jason's voice turned curious. Okay. And why exactly are we talking about this at midnight? Gabriel hesitated. He didn't want to say it out loud, because once he did, it would be real. I saw a kid today. Right. And? Gabriel clenched his jaw. He looked like me, Jason. Jason let out a short laugh. You're rich, man. Half the guys in the city probably try to look like you. Gabriel wasn't amused. He had my birthmark. Silence. And then, a slow, measured response. Your birthmark. Yes. Jason let out a breath. That's... damn. And you think, I don't know what I think? Gabriel muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. But I can't shake it. Jason didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, finally, if you really want answers, you know what you have to do. Gabriel closed his eyes. He didn't know. But the real question was he ready for what he might find? Lauren barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, the same thought circled in her mind, refusing to settle. Gabriel Langford could be Caleb's father. It sounded impossible, like something out of a dramatic movie rather than real life, and yet, every piece of information she had found pointed to that exact truth. Emma Chandler had been in a relationship with him, had vanished just before giving birth, and had put her child up for adoption, the child that was now asleep in the next room, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. By the time the sun rose, Lauren had made up her mind. She had to talk to Gabriel. She had to know for sure. It wasn't difficult to find where he would be. A man like Gabriel Langford didn't just exist quietly in the background. He was a force in the business world, his name attached to high-profile events, philanthropy, and an empire that had only grown over the years. A quick search revealed he was set to speak at a charity gala that weekend, an exclusive event for donors and influential figures in the city. Lauren hesitated only for a moment before buying a ticket. It was a risk, showing up unannounced, but she couldn't let this go. When the night of the gala arrived, Lauren felt out of place the moment she stepped into the grand ballroom. The air smelled of expensive perfume and aged whiskey, the chandeliers above casting a golden glow over the crowd of the city's elite. She smoothed down the simple navy dress she had chosen, knowing full well she didn't belong in this world, but none of that mattered right now. She was here for one reason. She spotted Gabriel immediately. He was standing near the stage, dressed in a sharp black suit, listening intently to someone who was speaking to him. Even from a distance, he carried himself with the same authority she had noticed at the park, the kind of presence that turned heads without him even trying. Her heart pounded. How was she supposed to do this? Taking a deep breath, she waited until he finished his conversation before stepping forward. Mr. Langford? He turned, his expression polite but unreadable, his gaze flicking over her quickly. It was the same look he had likely given 100 other people tonight, the kind of detached attentiveness reserved for strangers. Yes? Lauren swallowed, her hands tightening at her sides. I need to speak with you. It's about Emma Chandler. The polite expression disappeared instantly. His posture stiffened, and for the first time, there was something real in his eyes, something unsettled. What did you say? His voice was lower now, quieter. Lauren forced herself to hold his gaze. Emma Chandler. I think you should hear what I have to say. He studied her for a moment, and she could see the flicker of hesitation, the calculation happening behind his eyes. Then, without a word, he motioned for her to follow. He led her away from the noise of the ballroom, down a quiet hallway where only staff moved back and forth. When they were finally alone, he turned to face her, arms crossed, his expression sharp. Who are you? My name is Lauren Turner. she said, steadying herself. I know this is unexpected, but I need you to listen. His jaw tightened. How do you know Emma? I don't, she admitted. Not personally. But 6 years ago, she gave birth to a baby boy. She put him up for adoption. I adopted that baby. Gabriel didn't move. He didn't even blink. Lauren reached into her purse, pulling out the photograph she had brought, the one of Caleb as a baby, round-cheeked and wide-eyed, the birthmark on his tiny face unmistakable. She held it out to him. Gabriel stared at it. The moment stretched, heavy with something unspoken. Finally, he exhaled, shaking his head slightly. No, he muttered, but there was no conviction in his voice, only disbelief. He looked up at her, something sharp and defensive in his gaze. You're saying, I don't know what Emma told you. Maybe she didn't tell you anything at all. But Caleb is her son. And if I'm right, he's also yours. Gabriel took the photo from her hand, his fingers brushing against the edges as he stared at it again, as if looking harder would make it make sense. I never knew, he murmured. His voice had changed. Gone was the detached businessman, the man who had everything under control. In his place was someone who looked like the ground had just been ripped out from under him. She never told me. Lauren had suspected as much. I believe you. Gabriel let out a breath, running a hand over his face. I don't. He stopped, shaking his head again. This doesn't make sense. I know it's a lot, Lauren said, her voice softer now. I'm not here to disrupt your life. But after what happened at the park, after seeing the way you looked at him, the way he noticed you, I had to find out. Gabriel's hand curled around the photograph, his expression unreadable. And now that you have? Lauren hesitated. I don't know, she admitted. I wasn't planning on coming here to demand anything. Caleb doesn't even know. He's happy, he's loved. But I thought, if there was even the slightest chance you would want to know, I needed to give you that choice. Gabriel was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but still heavy with disbelief. A son. He let out a short, disbelieving laugh, though there was no humor in it. I have a son. Lauren watched as the reality of it settled over him, as the weight of years he hadn't known pressed into his shoulders. She had expected anger, denial, maybe even accusations, but instead, all she saw was shock. And something else. Something she hadn't expected. Regret. Gabriel looked up at her again, and this time, the confidence, the presence of the CEO who owned half the city, was nowhere to be found. He was just a man who had been blindsided by something he never saw coming. What now? He asked, his voice quiet. Lauren didn't have an answer for him. She supposed that was up to him to decide. Gabriel barely remembered leaving the gala. 1 minute, he had been standing there with that photograph in his hand, his world tilting sideways, and the next, he was in the back of his car, staring out the window while the city blurred past him. A son. He had a son. 6 years old, with his birthmark, his blood. And he had never known. Emma had disappeared, leaving him to go on with his life, oblivious to the fact that she had been carrying his child. He felt betrayed, furious, but mostly, he felt unsteady in a way he hadn't in years. By the time he got home, his mind was a storm of questions with no answers. He barely slept, alternating between pacing his apartment and staring at the photo Lauren had given him. His son. The words didn't feel real. But if they were, if this was really happening, then there was only one way to know for sure. The next morning, he called Lauren. She answered on the third ring, her voice wary. Gabriel? I want a DNA test. The words came out sharper than he intended, clipped and businesslike, as if this were just another deal to negotiate. I need proof. There was a pause. Then, Lauren sighed. I figured you'd say that. It's not that I don't believe you. Gabriel added quickly, though he wasn't sure that was entirely true. His whole life, he had trusted facts, numbers, tangible things. He needed something concrete, something undeniable. I need to be sure. I understand, Lauren said. But if you're doing this, I need you to understand something too. Caleb isn't. She hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. He isn't a business deal. He's a little boy. My son. His whole world is safe and stable, and I won't let you disrupt that unless you're sure about what you want. Gabriel's jaw tightened. I just want the truth. Then let's get the truth, she said. I'll set up the test. A few days later, Gabriel found himself sitting in a sterile medical office, staring at the swab in his hand. Lauren sat across from him, Caleb beside her, happily swinging his legs as he played with a small action figure. He was completely unaware of what was happening, just excited that he got to miss school for the afternoon. Lauren had told him it was just a simple check